So I'm guessing that I need to stop and you need to go.
There are more classes today, so you can hang around later.
So if you have more questions, you can ask them to me. I'm standing around here.
I got one more for you.
Okay, one more.
Maybe we'll make this the last one, Dr. Baycoat, if that's okay. Pain. You've been talking about pain tonight, today, and last night. And human beings have all sorts of amazing coping mechanisms for pain in our lives. We all do. And I was just intrigued by what you said earlier today about some of your colleague translators. And they're getting into drink and drugs, and I'm sure there's other things that people get into under major stress and pain. But I wonder if you could reflect on some of your observations about their lives and your relationship with them in light of our theme of moral formation.
Yeah.
I'm delighted by our theme of moral formation, and I'm quite intrigued and moved by your story of your formation through this process. But what have you learned from the interaction with them about moral formation?
Gosh, the three quick things. First quick thing is to point again to the book I started reading yesterday, Douglas Coupland's The Gum Thief. Coupland lives in Vancouver. He's a quirky contemporary author, but in this novel, he has one of the characters, has a child die, and he goes to visit the funeral director. And the funeral director, they're sort of, drinking scotch together there in the funeral home, and he says this. He said that if he's learned anything from doing his job, it is that if you don't have a spiritual practice in place when times are good, you can't expect to suddenly develop one during a moment of crisis. He said we're told by TV and movies and Reader's Digest that a crisis will trigger massive personal change and that those big changes will make the pain worthwhile. But from what he could see, big change almost never happens. People simply feel lost. They have no idea what to say or do or feel or think. They become messes and they tend to remain messes. Having a few default hymns and prayers at least makes the lack of crisis-born insight bearable. And I think that's the difference between me and my colleagues. I mean, yes, I became a mess. Yes, they became messes, but I had these default hymns from, at the Psalms, from 95 and then back to 82, that I could sort of draw on as I was unable to make sense of things. But I did have this fallback position, and most of my colleagues did not. So they were just in a terrible, terrible mess. And yes, I'm against coping. I mean, I try and cope. I don't think that that's always a good thing. But yes, I remember one of our best interpreters. This was she was a mature professional woman. She was about 10 years older than I am. She was a radio host. She was just together. By the time we were 6 months into working for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, she was taking medication to get going in the morning, taking medication to be able to sleep at night, and taking medication to help her body deal with the other medication that she was taking. So yeah, there were all kinds of ways in which people tried to cope. Second, because they didn't have the default hymns. Second observation is that I was a really bad neighbor to my fellow interpreters during those 2 years. I cannot say that I was of much help to anybody around me. In fact, quite to the contrary. I mean, I nearly lost my marriage because of that work. Angela can tell you that for 2 years, from my hotel room, wherever I was working, with so few exceptions, my goodnight words to her on the phone were expletives and directed at her because I was just such a mess, and then now I have to listen to, the troubles that she had with the duck poop in the pond and the babies and everything. I just, no, I don't need that, bye. So not only was I no help to my interpreter neighbors, I was destructive to people. So I didn't really learn anything while I was doing that. It was in reflection subsequently, and maybe I'll get to that tonight, especially while I was at Regent College. Angela and I, were able to reconnect with each other. we were able to do so in a context of prayer and Bible reading, which is why we went to Regent College. And I was able to reflect on just exactly how bad a neighbor I was to the people who were interpreting next to me. So really, for me, Psalm 51 arrived after I left the commission. And I was in beautiful Vancouver thinking back to, how badly I had done. So that's my second reflection. Moral formation took a little slowly there in the case of Gideon. But my boss, Theo Duplessis, the sociolinguist who pulled this all together, was just deep and profound believer, and no-nonsense kind of a, Dutch Calvinist type, who had years of his life spent in the anti-apartheid movement, so he had all kinds of credibility with people. But he was really just not a melodramatic personality like I am. He just got stuff done, and he knew how to get alongside these people who worked for him in the commission as interpreters. And so I think he salvaged quite a few people by pointing them to something just one tiny little anecdote on that, and I really am going to just stop. Desmond Tutu was the supreme leader and father figure of all of us who worked for the commission. He was an incredible man in that sense, a saint. And I'll talk about him a bit tonight. But it turns out that he grew up Seventh-day Adventist, which I didn't know. And we discovered this because one of my fellow interpreters belonged to the same congregation as Desmond Tutu's older sisters. He had these two older sisters who were spinsters. And they were really worried about him because he'd strayed, from the straight and narrow. And they knew he was drinking. He didn't drink a lot. Like you would have like a glass of wine over dinner, right? But they were teetotalers and vegetarians and didn't have coffee. And they would send him baked goods with this other woman and little knitted things, like knitted socks for the Archbishop. And it was just so quaint, to think that this sort of gray-headed eminence, this person we all sort of were in awe of, had older sisters who disapproved of his lifestyle. And I remember Theo and this woman, the Seventh-day Adventist, who was interpreting with us, having this salutary effect on people by, among other things, just inviting them to church when we were out on the road. Or sitting with them in the pub when they were drinking and just listening. Theo was really good at being an ear, so we would, tell our stories of the day with, wide-eyed shock and disbelief. And there'd be someone who was sort of stable. And so, in retrospect, I want to grow up to be like Theo Duplessis. And have enough of a backdrop of wonder and hope that I can locate the heartbreak that I'm experiencing and that people are experiencing around me in such a way that I can be alongside them in a way that reweaves some of the shalom. I don't know if that's even a straightforward answer, but okay. So thank you, everyone.